everybody for coming. Thanks to Jennifer and Daryl and the J School for putting this on. My name is Jarrett and I'm the editor-at-large at City Limits. I can see some of the names and I know just about everybody, so that's probably unnecessary formality. But I'm very pleased to be having this discussion tonight on a topic that's become more and more important to me. I recently passed my 14th anniversary at City Limits, and one thing that has struck me is that a lot of the social issues that we talk about back at the beginning of my tenure, we and a few other media outlets were sort of voices in the wilderness. And over the years, that's changed, and there's been a lot more awareness of problems with the criminal justice system, of poverty, the affordable housing crunch. Issues like that are getting a lot more attention from the mainstream press, and that's all to the good. One issue that is still not, and that frankly we're paying more attention to now than we did before, is the issue of aging. Which is a tremendously complex and fascinating and totally undercovered story, and one that we're going to talk about tonight. Just to frame it, obviously, it's a very important topic. It's, involves fundamental issues of human dignity. I found it fascinating because it intersects with so many of the other things that good social issues journalists talk about, like race, gender, poverty, and immigration. It's obviously a big issue. There are already more than 1 million New Yorkers 65 or older, and that population is expected to grow roughly about another 20% by 2040. By that point, there'll be 1.4 million New Yorkers who we might consider senior citizens, which by today's standards is equivalent to the population of like San Diego. So on its own, it would be the 8th largest US city. And what's interesting too is that a lot of the stuff that we cover as social justice journalists and urban journalists is often about things that happen to other people. I'm a white man, and we talk about things that happen to people who are from other races, or we talk about people who are immigrants, even though we're citizens. And so it's often about something that can only happen to someone else, but aging is something that's going to happen to all of us. And so I feel like there's a direct personal stake in it. And obviously, as journalists, an undercovered story is kind of unfortunate from a citizen standpoint, but great from a journalist standpoint, because it means there's juicy stories out there for you to do. And so tonight we're going to talk a little bit about what some of those stories are, how to approach them, some of the rules of the road and the basics of the issue, and hear from a great panel. And hopefully we'll have time at the end for your questions. If you have a question at any point, put it in the chat, and I might throw it to the panelists right away, or I might go to it at the end, but don't wait to offer it. If it's on your mind, let me know, and we'll try to get it into the fabric of the discussion. But let me introduce my esteemed panel that I'm joined by. Caitlin Andrews is the Director of Public Policy at Live On New York, a membership organization representing more than 100 community-based organizations that serve older New Yorkers. Kevin Jones is AARP New York's Associate State Director for Advocacy, covering New York City. Christian Gonzalez Rivera is the Director of Strategic Policy Initiatives at the Brookdale Center for Healthy Aging, which is CUNY's Aging Research Policy and Professional Development Center located at Hunter College. And Bobby Sackman is a member leader with Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, or JFREJ. And Bobby is a longtime advocate for older New Yorkers throughout her 40-year career in the aging issues arena. Welcome, panelists. Welcome, everybody. And we're going to start in the way of an introduction by going around and asking everyone on the panel, when did aging become your issue, and why? And why don't we start with you, Bobby?
Sure. Thank you, Jarrett, and thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. So as you can see, I've aged into my own field, and my story began, and maybe you all can begin to think for yourselves. We like to ask people, what is your care story? Because most people have one. So literally 50 years ago, my grandmother lived with us, and this was before there was Medicaid home care. Only 5 years earlier, we even got Medicaid enacted. She ended up in a nursing home after a stroke. She died bitterly in a nursing home. My parents and my uncle were torn apart. And that's when I began. I was on my way to social work school, and something in my 21-year-old brain said, this is terrible. I had other words for it too, but this is terrible. There was nothing waiting for my grandmother. We called her Bubby Jenny. She was an immigrant, and there was nothing waiting for my family. And that's when I started, and nobody quite knew the word gerontology then. And as Jarrett said, it's totally exploded now in terms of, in a good way, in terms of the population and the issues. So that's sort of what keeps me going forward, as it were.
Christian, how about you? What brings you to this topic, or what brought you to this topic?
Sure. Well, there's actually two things. I mean, the first one is that I, for a long time, have been working around the issues of people of color, how demographics affect economic change and economic opportunity. And, you know, one day in looking at demographic statistics, we discovered that at that time, almost half of older adults in New York City are immigrants, which I thought was very interesting, especially because I hadn't seen a lot written about that or anybody really talking about that. And when I started to look to see, I mean, it's like what has been written about that, I was shocked to discover that it wasn't. So at first I thought it was a mistake. You know, it's just like, well, this can't possibly be right. I mean, somebody would have noticed this. But in fact, back in 2013, I published my first study in the field of aging called The New Face of New York Seniors, that detailed the demographics of the population and also asked the question, are older immigrants in particular accessing the services that are available for older adults in New York City? And the answers really differed with all the different ethnic communities in the city. So that was sort of a big introduction. I mean, it's like just sort of noticing a pattern. But then, you know, since 2013, it's been a long time, and I've had a lot of time to sort of reflect on what keeps me in the field. And I realized that one of those things is that it's also personal. I grew up with my grandmother. My grandmother lived with us all of my childhood, and up until the day she died. She came over to the United States with my parents from Cuba in 1980. And I realized that one of the big reasons why our family was able to go from literally my parents came here with just the clothes on their back. I mean, not metaphorically, just actually literally jumped on a boat, came over to start from that to us getting to the middle class is because my grandmother, when my mom was raising me as a child, my grandmother and my father worked to support the family. And then when my mother went to work, my grandmother stayed and was our caretaker and made sure that we went to school, made sure that we did our homework, did all the things that, you know, did all the childcare, all of the work that was necessary to run the household. When my parents worked, you know, in my father's case, up to 3 jobs, and in my mother's case, 1 or 2 jobs. So I realized that, yeah, my grandmother was a part of my story of where I am now. And that was a really big realization. It started with the numbers, but then it became personal.
Kevin, what's your backstory in terms of this issue?
Sure. So I came to New York in about 2011 and started working before AARP, which I joined just in June. So I started working with a lobbying firm, and I always kind of was drawn to nonprofit work and things that impacted communities. But it did always feel a little more disconnected for me, you know, being white male when you're talking about ethnic or racial minorities, things like that. You know, they were things I enjoyed working on, but it was, like I said, a little bit disconnected from my personal story. And then I started working with a group, an LGBTQ charity and social services group out of Long Island. And I never will forget the time someone from that group, I think it was the executive director there, told me that when LGBTQ people go to congregate care or nursing homes or places like that, they very often have to go back in the closet. And as someone who struggled a great deal when I was younger coming out, that really, I mean, it just hit me unlike almost anything else had in a really, really long time. And because of that story, you know, it just kind of, it put something kind of on my radar that was not just personal to me, but it was very specific to aging. And it also was just such a unique story and such a unique issue that other people, you know, don't have to face, right? Because someone who is not white generally can't hide that. right? With some very few exceptions. So that's really what got me interested in those issues. And then through that organization, I was also able to work with some other, programs through City Department for the Aging and things like that. But I think that's what turned it into, or that I should say, that's what kind of transitioned it in for me from an issue that I work on amongst many others to something that I knew that really had a profound impact on people's lives, because I couldn't even fathom having to go through that myself.
Thank you. And Caitlin, how about you?
Sure. So, and as the motorcycles drive by, you can tell it's New York and it's starting to get nice outside. Sorry about that. So I grew up very similar, seeing the issues within my own family, as my paternal grandfather on both sides had Alzheimer's. And I saw both my mother's family and my father's family as siblings and units trying to find care for their father, my grandfathers in each case, for somebody with Alzheimer's. And it was difficult how to see that impact on caregivers, loved ones, predominantly daughters, and the stress that can take. I also grew up in a household where my father was a union labor leader. And so I had that history of organizing in my blood, so to speak. And I knew there's something here that can be done and more we can be doing. And I just wanted to jump in and get started. And I'm lucky that Live on New York has been that springboard for me to represent the community-based organizations that are doing this work in community on the ground. And I also think so much of the solutions that we as a country are trying to find in terms of healthcare, we're trying to find solutions to downstream impacts. So often we're trying to treat the disease rather than build the systems that will eradicate the disease itself. So to speak, we are trying to fund nursing homes rather than community supports. And just the way that we're approaching care has been misplaced for so long. And I just see this system as an opportunity to really create a better, more caring society. And I'm excited to be a part of seeing that shift.
So Kevin, clue us in on exactly what we're talking about here in terms of the population. At what point do we say that someone has gone from being younger to being a member of the aging? And are there ways to divvy up that period of life into smaller portions, different phases of aging that we talk about? And what's the right nomenclature to use for people who are in that segment of their lives? What's the kind of term of art?
Sure. I think one thing I'll say, and as someone said this to me right when I started with AARP, is we are all aging, right? If we are lucky, we are all aging. So, AARP, we talk a lot about the 50 plus, and that's who we represent. And I know for us specifically, we have to push back a lot where people, when they see AARP is coming in to talk to them, the first thing they want to talk about is people that are retired or people over 85, or, and I think we see a lot of age numbers right now because of the COVID vaccine, and they were, kind of subdivided. But, the exact number for these are going to be different from issue to issue, right? I mean, a lot of the workforce discrimination issues, for example, people will report having experienced ageism in the workplace, in their 40s, right? That's not something that just happens in their 60s. So I think that not to be too evasive on it, but I think there really is no one answer to that question. I think it really depends on which issue you're talking about. I think we very specifically at AARP will use, if we say something is about seniors, we're talking about something that is very clearly defined already. And we want to make sure that we're not using terms because they're just kind of easy nomenclature that we're used to, or phrases we're used to saying, that lumps too many people together. I think the key is trying to really drill down on the population you're talking about and the specific issue of impact that's being addressed.
That makes sense. And Christian, having started your answers tonight by talking about statistics, what are some numbers that you rely on or that come to mind in terms of describing the size of this population now, its presence in this city, any interesting features about it statistically? Are there any digits we should keep in mind?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I wanted to, on the way to answering that, I wanted to piggyback off of something that Kevin said. And that is, I mean, it's like the idea of older adults being reported on or talked about as a monolith. I mean, let's remember, I mean, it's like whether you use the cutoff of 50 or 60 or 65, whatever it is, when you're talking about older adults, you're talking about people, let's just say 50 to 100 and beyond, right? I mean, it's like, so there are at least two generations of people in that range. And a 62-year-old has little in common with a 92-year-old, except that people call them senior citizens, right? So I think in that itself, I mean, it's like, it seems obvious, you know, but you see a lot of stories where, I mean, it's like, it's about the experience of older adults, but then the people that you see featured are 85 or 92, you know, I mean, it's like people who are older, giving the impression that everybody is frail, everybody has illnesses, et cetera, et cetera. It's like painting with one big brush a whole group of people that span multiple generations. So I just wanted to say that. I mean, it's like based on what Kevin said. I mean, it's like because I feel like that's something that's really important. Another piece, I mean, in term that is important, and this gets to the statistics part, is that not only are older adults diverse in terms of the age range, but also in terms of race and ethnicity. One of the, to give a little insight into some of the statistics that sort of raised my eyebrows when I started doing this work, currently more than half of older New Yorkers are immigrants. So, you know, currently 51% are immigrants. And not only that, but immigrants and people of color are responsible for almost all of the growth in New York City's older adult population.
Mm-hmm.
To give an example, I mean, it's like over the past decade, the number of older immigrants has increased by 40%, while the number of US born older adults have increased by 8%. And of course, I mean, when I say immigrants, I mean, it's like a lot of these people have been here for over a decade. I mean, it's like, you know, 9 out of 10 of them have been here for over a decade, and they just aged into the older adult age category, right? And so, so that's something that's extremely important in itself. I mean, it's like where, when you're talking about the experience of older adults, not only can you not paint a broad brush across ages, but also across race and ethnicity and all the different experiences that come with that. Older adults are just as diverse as many other age groups as well. So I think these are all important things to point out.
Definitely, very much so. And Caitlin, like any policy issue, any issue area, there's some unique vocabulary that's associated with discussing aging across that age span. What comes to mind for you in terms of important acronyms or terminology that someone diving into this issue for the first time should probably know?
Yeah, so with any issue, you have to have your alphabet soup to go with it. So in this case, we have DFTA, which is the Department for the Aging. It's a small agency within the city, too small by our opinions. Currently, the budget is only less than 1% of the overall budget, despite the great, massive population that Christian just talked about. So certainly believe it should be larger, but that is, you're going to hear us DFTA, DFTA, DFTA. Department for the Aging. It's responsible for all of the services that an older adult might need, particularly older adults that live above the Medicaid line, but just don't have enough to private pay for certain services. And what those services might look like are a senior center. So if you've never been to a senior center, obviously right now in person, you're not able to just walk in. Hopefully soon we're back open in the buildings. They're operating virtually right now. You can learn about what goes on in these spaces. A senior center is not a nursing home. A senior center is not assisted living. It's a place in community where older adults can get a meal, can get assistance with benefits and entitlements. And similarly, there are these programs called NORCs, naturally occurring retirement communities. These are places within buildings where there's a large swath of older adults living there. Maybe they aged in place and the building now has such a cohort of older individuals, older tenants living there that it makes sense to have some case management, light touch services, nursing services on site to make that aging process better and to facilitate strong aging in community.
That's great. Thank you. And, you know, Bobby, one thing that came to mind as Christian was talking about the diversity of the aging population and its span is that, you know, the stereotypes, the kind of monolithic stereotypes about aging have probably always been inaccurate. but they are increasingly so because obviously what aging consists of is changing. A lot of people are living longer, able to be active longer, working longer. I know you've been involved in a process or an effort to reframe aging. Can you talk about what reframing aging is, and also talk to us about what does ageism mean to you?
So, and I want to just say, I know Caitlin knows some of this stuff too, so if she wants to jump in afterwards. So, ageism, like any other ism, it's a form of discrimination and stereotypes. And in this case, it's based on age. And it's so wildly outdated. I love my grandmother, but I am not my grandmother's generation. I have been afforded some more opportunities, but it's not just economic. I just think that we're growing older differently now as society has changed. And what's interesting is think about this past year with COVID. First of all, there's got to be a million stories about what happened with older adults. Some of them obviously tragic because they died in nursing homes or at home or in hospitals in terms of COVID. But think about the resilience. You see, this is the positive. There are certain things that you, with age and the life experience, you build resilience, you build experience, you build skills. And that has nothing to do with ethnicity, with economics, level of education, whether you were born here or you immigrated here, whether you have, if you're undocumented or documented. By the way, all the services offered by the Department for the Aging, nobody asks you documentation. You are eligible. You can walk into a senior center. You can get other services if you're homebound. Anyway, so we bring so much to the table in terms of experience and ideas, but we're not usually asked, and we're often overlooked. And to me, that's what ageism is. It's like any other ism where you are rendered invisible. I believe, as we saw with the nursing homes, you are rendered disposable. And so that's where you begin to get the intersectionality. And it's not just to compare, like, is it this ism or that ism? Is this ism as bad as that ism? This is all about how do we build a society, and I call it age justice, and Jarrett, that's what he called his series in City Limits, age justice. How do we build a society that has justice so we can all thrive throughout our lives? So it's not one generation versus another. And I think, and what Caitlin was raising a little bit earlier, I just want to sort of amplify a little, is all of these community-based services offered by the Department for the Aging are solutions to help us thrive. So if you go to a senior center, that's a peer community. You need a peer community till the end of your life. That's called being human. Again, look at the impact of COVID. If you need home care, I'm working on a state issue to get fair pay for home care workers who earn all of $19,000 a year, and they're mostly women of color. So look at the whole, what's going on. That's racist. So there's a lot of these stories around, and how you frame the momentum that we have as we keep growing older is a very important piece. Now, you asked about language, and I'll finish with this. Seniors, senior citizens, older adults, some people will say older people. I don't know that we've quite settled. I personally like older adults better than seniors, although seniors sometimes is a little easier if you're writing and talk, just because we don't call other people juniors, So I was kidding with someone the other day. She posted something that her kid said she was 6, and she said, "Oh, Ma, I forgot something, but I thought that only happens to old people." It was, she was laughing, and I said, "Yeah, I guess that's a junior moment." So again, but there's a lot of very important stories, especially in local press, in local communities, of who were the anchors in families and communities. And if you delve into a little bit, you're going to find it's older adults a lot. And I'll stop.
I'll just jump in really quickly. I think as we start to talk about these issues, start to look at the world around you. And are you seeing a society that you would want to age in? Would you want to be an older adult in this society? Look at the birthday cards. Are they age friendly, or are they poking fun? look at the makeup aisle. Are all of the lotions about anti-aging, or is it about embracing your age? What are we sending as a message? And would you want to age in that society? And if it's not the society you want to be aging into, then we have to do something together to change that. And language is a big way to start that conversation.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Obviously, those are some story ideas right there. But let's talk about other potential stories, either broad topics or specific ideas that need covering in New York City when it comes to aging issues. And specifically, let's stay with Caitlin. Election 2021 coming up, or actually underway as we speak. What do you see as some aging issues that are coming up in the campaign or should be coming up?
Sure. So we had a listening session with more than 100 older adults that participated, sharing what are their concerns, what do they want mayoral candidates, city council candidates to be caring about. By and large, housing was one of the biggest issues that needs to be discussed. Similarly, the funding for these services that we've been talking about, senior centers, et cetera, is something that is a major concern. And when we're talking about so many forums, platforms, aging might be there. Is it upfront? Is the 20% of the population that we're talking about really reflected in the policy platforms that we're seeing? That's important. And it's something that older adults are looking to see, older voters are looking to see. And I mean, at Live on New York, we're going to be hosting a mayoral forum with City Limits on April 14th. That's going to be a great opportunity to hear from candidates. What are they thinking about? How are they going to build a better New York to age in? What does that look like? I think food security, isolation, the digital divide, there are so many things that have come up recently that older adults want to see candidates addressing in their platforms. And often the issues are not, what are you going to do for me? We heard so many candidates saying, education. I want to know, what are you going to do for my grandchild? It is an intersectional approach that we would love to see. And we just want older adults to be included in that. And I know, Bobby, I mean, we've talked about this a lot, how the whole city council is going to change soon. And so many of these local programs are supported by city council members. So it's a massive shift in our city, even on the local level, beyond the mayoral race. We're concerned about making sure that every candidate, whether you're running for this district, comptroller, borough president, mayor, are thinking about the older adult population when creating platforms and creating an age-friendly city.
Actually, I want to stay with the election for a second, because one impression I had before I started digging into this issue a few years back was the stereotype that older people are much more likely to vote, and therefore that they would have a certain amount of power because they were dependable voters. And so people running for mayor or council always go to the senior centers to meet people because it's an easy way to do that. And you know that that crowd is very likely to turn out. Bobby, does that translate into political power? And does it translate into power that address the systemic issues, or more just sort of like, you know, getting funding for the senior center, but perhaps not digging deeper into some of these issues that we've raised?
I think we could all agree that if it really translated into political power to the level we'd like to see it, we'd all be at the beach already. It has, you know, it's always been frustrating where candidates left and right come through the senior centers and basically say, I love my mother. Some of them get into a little more detail. I know Live On, and I'm sure AARP have worked really hard to educate individuals, whether at senior centers or in other settings, to ask questions, you know, to help people prepare questions if a candidate's going to be there. And so it doesn't, I mean, in my opinion, I think the others might agree, but we'd have to ask them, it doesn't translate to the level of power. I know we've thrown around a lot of statistics. I want to add one thing. There's 1.7 million people over the age of 60, and the Department for the Aging Services begin at 60. That's just by federal law. That is 100,000 people larger than the whole city of Philadelphia. I know you mentioned San Diego, but this is Philadelphia. Can you just imagine? That's just our older adult population. So it doesn't translate. And I think that, again, I think that there's a bottom line of ageism in there and not taking people seriously in terms of what concerns them and, you know, what do they want to talk about and see. And I want, again, one more quick thing about what Caitlin said about the city budget, because we're going through it now. And obviously Kevin and Caitlin could add to this. They've been enmeshed in it for a long time. So city council gets a certain pot of this, each member gets a discretionary pot just for older adults that they can, you know, it's member items. They can put around their communities, fund different groups. They also have created city council different specific funding streams, but it's only good year to year. It's not what they call baseline or made permanent in the mayor's budget. So every year, every January, and this is true for the last 20 years, Bloomberg devastated the Department for the Aging. He was literally blood, sweat, and tears. De Blasio, there's been new money. It has come back somewhat, but not, he hasn't added enough, and it's always a struggle. So every January, the budget of DFTA goes down in the preliminary budget, and then OMB cleverly says, well, no, you know, it was just year-to-year funding. Well, that's like being a little bit pregnant. You're paying for jobs, you're paying for services. You're not taking these services and the people they serve, and by the way, the workforce, which is also comprised mostly of people of color, and you're not taking them seriously by saying, oh, you know, you could fight for the same money every year and we'll see if you get it back. So there's a lot of stories in the city budget process of why don't older adults and their services rise more to the level of funding.
Yeah, and I think that it's easy for candidates potentially to not realize how local some of these issues are. I think sometimes we get a lot of attention on the federal level with Medicaid or Medicare, Social Security, those larger issues, and think that that's enough. Like if Social Security isn't cut, then older adults are good. That is baseline. Social Security, if you're just receiving Social Security payments and you're living as an older adult in New York City, you're living in poverty. It is going to take more, and local decision making is huge in terms of ensuring that older adults can thrive in New York City. Land use decisions. Are you making sure that your district is pushing through affordable senior housing buildings? Are you ensuring that the district is prioritizing benches throughout so that an older adult can rest throughout the walk if that's necessary? There are so many local ways that you can be doing more for older constituents that doesn't necessarily translate from the campaign to the action after the fact.
Let's bring
Can
Kevin in
I
on
add
that.
one? Yeah, sorry, I was a little excited to add one thing because
Yes.
Bobby made a really good point about discretionary funding, and Bobby laid it out in a way that really does kind of point to how kind of treacherous it can be to try to operate with this year, applying for this funding from the individual council members year to year. But one of the things that she left out is that when the council turns over and new council members come in, those new council members put their own list together of local organizations that they're going to fund. So in a previous role that I had, I remember that when new council members came in, if there was an organization that wanted to apply for funding, we would always tell them the first year of the council member's term is the easiest time to get on that list. Because if you don't get on that list that first year, the second year, in order to get on, that council member has to kick somebody off the list, right? So no matter how great a program it could be that they could fund, if they want to fund it, they have to go to somebody else and say, you don't get funding this year. Right, so just there's a structural problem that is not talked about very much, just in terms of building out infrastructure and building out capacity for these groups that do so much, like Caitlin said, in the community. Right, so these discretionary pots, they can pay for all kinds of things that really could otherwise fall through the cracks, and I think that's great. The problem is when the DFTA budget is so low, what you have is a bunch of organizations trying to do good work and trying to provide services that really can't plan, and a council member leaving could be devastating for them.
Let me bring Christian in because I want to talk about something that I think a few people have referenced, but Christian most extensively. And And that is the question of how the issue of aging intersects with race, with gender, with LGBTQ issues, with immigration. When you think of that, what are some of the specific stories where that intersectionality manifests itself that you think warrant more attention?
Yeah, and so I think one of the biggest, in terms of sort of like a big theme that is already salient today that has to do with racism, ageism, I mean, the intersections of race and ethnicity and age, et cetera, is the fact that the big debate of this moment now is between the forces of inclusion versus the forces of exclusion. When you think about racism, when you think about ageism, when you think about sexism, those are all forms of, sort of elevating one group above the other, excluding one group from, the decision making or any kind of tables of agency in society. And so, what this moment is showing us, I mean, it's like in particular, I mean, it's like the manifestations around around Black Lives Matter and all of the really popular movements that we've seen lately, is that there's a lot of work to be done to be a truly inclusive society. That inclusive is a term that we've thrown around very often, but haven't really sort of done the work to really make it real. And I think that one of the big lessons that has to do with inclusivity is sort of the interdependence of many groups of people. And not only that, but also the idea that, I mean, it's like what benefits people of color can benefit everyone. What benefits, something like, for instance, like paid leave. I mean, it's to give a specific example. Paid leave helps not only expecting mothers, but also people who are taking care of older adults. Better parks infrastructure, both benefits older adults, who want to get exercise, and also benefits children. I mean, it's like who need recreation. So in essence, when you put an investment into infrastructure that affects everyone and are, sort of keeping in mind, I mean, it's like how different groups are going to use it and also how individuals are going to use it across their life course. And the way I think about it is, I mean, it's like, I think, Caitlin, I think you were the one who mentioned it, or maybe Bobby, really thinking about, when you're thinking about older adult issues, would you want to live as an older adult in the society that we have today? When you think about what access exists and what access doesn't exist, I mean, it's like, what would you like to see? And I think that a lot of that has to do with, are you able to take advantage of the things that you're taking advantage of now across your life course or not? The parks, the infrastructure, perceived access to education, even access to third spaces like restaurants and community centers. What access do you have now versus not? And we've been used to talking about this in terms of being mediated through race, where you have microaggressions, you have sort of perceived or real exclusion of people who are lower income, people across different classes. But the same thing also happens when ageism comes into play. So I think that one of the bigger stories here is that when we're talking about inclusion more broadly, when you're plumbing sort of racism, sexism, et cetera, also think about ageism along those lines, and think about it in terms of what does it mean to exclude older people, and how are some of the same systems that exclude people of color or exclude other particular groups also at play when it comes to excluding older people. So I think, I mean, it's like that would add another dimension to stories about inclusion.
And one of the things that I find a little tricky to navigate sometimes is, I think, an outgrowth of the kind of zero-sum way we approach politics sometimes. And I take immigration as an example of that. Obviously, the conversation on immigration in New York City and to some degree around the country in recent years has been dominated by discussions of DACA and the DREAM Act, which are great. But obviously, some of the older immigrants that you were talking about earlier, whether they came recently or long ago, those programs probably don't apply to them, probably don't address their most pressing needs. And so they're kind of excluded from that conversation, even though that's a beneficial move on the policy front in terms of immigration in general. it doesn't really address specific issues that are facing older immigrants.
Right. And this is one place where one of the, I mean, the fact is, I mean, it's like when you're talking about people who are undocumented, I mean, it's like in all these issues that you just described, the vast majority of people who are undocumented are not older. I mean, it's like there are people who came here to work when they were much younger. I mean, it's like when you look at the statistics of when people arrived, how long have they been in this country? Most people arrived in their 20s and 30s among the people who are older now. So the vast majority of the older immigrant population aged into the older segment. That being said, I mean, it's like this is another place where sort of the interrelationships come into play, where there are a lot of older adults who serve as caretakers, and yet there are not a lot of services that help them once they get older. If especially, I mean, it's like if families are lower income and are not able to support them. And so part of this, I mean, it's like is something that could be solved through services, as Caitlin and Bobby were saying. I mean, you know, just having more targeted services that specifically work with immigrant populations. And one thing that we were very happy to see over the past decade is that there has been some discretionary funding from the city council, specifically into immigrant senior centers. And that's something that in the next iteration of leadership, we do want to see that continue, but also take a step further. I mean, it's like, fully integrating the needs of an increasingly diverse older adult population into all services, but also into making sure that, you know, there are spaces for recreation, that there are third spaces that older adults can inhabit across all the communities in the city. Because while you have some populations, like for instance, I mean, it's like the Chinese population or the Dominican population, where there's a large percentage of people who are older, there's a lot more attention paid to making sure that there's spaces for them because there's such a large population. But then when you have immigrant groups that are not very large and that are more recent, like the Bengali population, for instance, or the Nepali population, these are populations that are largely younger with a few older adults. And so sometimes they can fall through the cracks because of that lack of a third space, because of, you know, sort of finding a space that is so oriented around hustling and making ends meet, raising families, etc. So again, I mean, it's like, it seems amorphous, but I mean, it's another one of those times, I mean, where you're sort of invited to think about your own privilege in terms of what you think you have access to, what you think you don't have access to, what you feel like you're invited to, what you feel like you're not invited to. And when you look across many different populations, and also especially how uneven different services and different pieces of infrastructure are across the city, that represents different whole communities who have a completely different experience of aging in New York City than someone else might. And to the extent that there are immigrant groups that are concentrated in those, that just shows how important it is, I mean, to make sure that infrastructure is accessible everywhere, and to people across the life course.
Kevin, when we think about the economic issues that are most relevant for older New Yorkers, and I'm thinking about housing, poverty, and hunger chiefly. This is probably a more complex question than I should be asking at this point, but is this about sort of a lack of policies and programs, or is this about programs and policies that simply need more money? Where do you think the tension is between the needs of older New Yorkers and what's being done now?
Well, obviously, and I think anyone that's doing any advocacy work in New York City would say that they probably need more money, and I think that they're probably all right. But one thing that I think that I think it's that we're just not thinking about aging and what it means, and how to really develop a livable community where we are for folks, whether that means someone that does need the food services. Like obviously with the pandemic, there were a lot of meal sites that were not able to operate, and a big rush to get that. There were definitely plenty of mistakes along the way. But I think that one of the things that is not really thought about very much or talked about with this issue enough is that we're not really investing in this early on. You can't just wait until someone is at retirement age and then try to get the services to them then. One of the reports that AARP did, this has been several years now, was about the financial anxiety of people that are approaching retirement age and working, because this is an expensive city to live in. And what we found was that 66% of Gen Xers expected to leave New York City in order to retire, right? And I think that really says a lot, not just about what, the obvious things that we all see about what it would be like to age in these communities that we live in the city. I think that oh, sorry. Did you hear me?
Yep, we got you.
Oh, sorry, my my computer blinked for a second. But yeah, the economic anxiety for folks that are approaching that, it kind of baffles me that we can see that approaching for ourselves, but we're not really applying that mindset to the people that are already there, right? So, Kristen very eloquently spoke about the different needs for these different communities, but really it's all the same. We just have to figure out a way to deliver them to people that have a different lived experience. And I think that's one of the things that we really have to concentrate on, because it's housing, it's socialization, healthcare, and a lot of these things are changing rapidly, but we're not paying enough attention to how to get these services to the people where they are, as opposed to just give DFTA a little bit of money and to run a meals program or to run a healthcare program.
We're rapidly coming up to the end of our time, and so I want to get to a couple questions we've received, and then maybe get back to some of the ones that I have. And I'm going to throw this to Caitlin. A very interesting question. Are there other cities or local governments, I guess either here or abroad, that New York City can emulate to become more age-friendly? Are there examples out there that New York City might follow?
So the country that we are often compared to is Japan in terms of just demographics. So that's a place to always be looking at for what type of policies might we consider. And similarly, I know the Japanese delegation came and was looking at our NORCs as the model that they might incorporate. So there's some shared learning opportunities there. But I know that Boston is often, and Massachusetts is often out in front in terms of what they're doing and creating age-friendly spaces, as well as Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has their lottery, whatever, there's a system for when you buy a lottery ticket, that funding goes directly to senior services. We don't really have an earmarked way to be funding senior services within New York State or New York City. It's all fighting it out within the general pot of funds that exists, whereas other states have created mechanisms to ensure that that funding is coming year after year.
Interesting. And Bobby, another question we've received from the chat is, COVID-19 obviously has shined a light on a lot of social problems, or a brighter light on ones we already knew about. Do you feel as though it's played, in a silver lining way, a helpful role at elevating some of the issues around aging? Do you have any optimism that they're going to get more attention because of what we saw COVID did?
Well, you've asked many questions and you included the word optimism. So yes, no, absolutely. Sadly losing thousands, 15,000 in New York State, people in nursing homes, and some of that unnecessarily, is so tragic. And I think of people in nursing homes in the general public eye, this might sound harsh, as the most disposable people. Like, why would you put your mother in a nursing home? And yet these families are so torn apart and in grief about what has happened. And so, as I mentioned a little earlier, I've been doing work on the state level on this Fair Pay for Home Care Act. Live on New York, Caitlin represents an AARP in the city, work on a program with a terrible acronym. It's EISEP. I'll put in chat what it stands for. And it's a state city funded program for people above the Medicaid level to get a social worker into the home to assess your situation and if you're lucky, get some home care hours. Not as generous as Medicaid. Last June, if I remember correctly, Caitlin, there were 3,000 people waiting for case management in New York City. These are 80, 90-year-old people. And then I found out recently that across New York State in this EISEP program, there are 4,000 people waiting for home care. Just take that in. So while there's a light and we want to keep the light there in a fruitful way, and what we keep saying is there are solutions in the community. Just look at how we've allowed government and society in general to operate that way, that we could allow this. And then that's just real quickly, how much of a woman's issue this is as well. Most older adults, well, women still live longer, but most older adults who are poor and live alone, at least in New York City, probably generally, are women. Most of the workforce, are women and women of color. And it's low paid, and in this network we call the Aging Services Network, most of them don't have a pension to retire to. They will become the next generation of elderly poor. And so every angle of this is making it a woman's issue. And the saying is that the best long-term care insurance is having a daughter or a daughter-in-law. Well, whoopee-doo. Just take that one in. And daughters and daughter-in-law are willing to help, and hopefully their husbands and other males are willing to help too, but they need help. It's very isolating and difficult to be a caregiver, especially like Caitlin, you mentioned grandparents having Alzheimer's. That's very difficult. So to look at how do we build a feminist agenda across the lifespan so that we as women can thrive. And I think that's very much a part of this. So all of this is beginning to shine a light from COVID. The concern I'm sure we all share is how deep and how long will that last?
Yeah, and I think the fact that some of those caregivers are themselves older New Yorkers is a major part of the issue, and goes to the multi-generational aspect that Christian was talking about. And just to mention quickly, that ties into the workforce issue, which I think is a story in this topic area in two ways. One is that aging New Yorkers face a lot of discrimination in the workforce. Being forced out, being blocked out of jobs, that's a very alive issue. And then the workforce that cares for and serves that population is an underpaid, heavily female, largely person of color workforce. And so that's another huge, huge issue. We are moving toward the last few minutes. If you have questions, audience, you want to type it in the chat, we'll try to get to them. But let's try to go around the horn and talk about some kind of practical tips for reporters who want to dive into this. And Caitlin, starting with you, what are some resources for stats, for terminology, for research, for sourcing that you would point people to?
Yeah, so Live on New York, we're an umbrella organization that represents more than 100 community-based organizations, and they then serve older adults who would love opportunities to share their unique experiences in the press, to share firsthand what they're seeing, and have that voice come straight from the older adult on what we can be doing as a city, and really help foster that coverage and build that out. So we're a resource. We will connect you with the nonprofits across the city. I also would suggest the New York Academy of Medicine has an Image NYC map that will show you where are the senior centers across the city, where are vaccination sites, what are the demographics. It's really fun to play around with, and can show you a lot about what does New York City have currently, and could potentially be good background as you're looking into issues of housing, hunger, et cetera. And then I would also say open data, the budget, they're documents of values. I know it's cliche to say, but when you look at them around budget time, take a look at the Department for the Aging budget, what is being received. I think we were all seeing the clapping at 7 p.m. Let's see if that leads to real investment in this workforce, the essential workforce across the human services portfolio, not just within the Department for the Aging, but everybody who is working to support older New Yorkers and all New Yorkers who experience increased needs during this time. So I think the budget documents paint a picture that's important, but the data can't tell the story itself, as you all know. And so would love to dive into that and to have older adults share and give light to what that data means to them personally, and what the lack of investment means in their community.
Excellent. Christian, we have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to go into my like debate moderator mode and say everyone has a minute now to weigh in with a closing thought. I know I should give you more time for this, but what are some quick kind of pitfalls that you would warn reporters to avoid as they delve into this topic? Does anything come off the top of your head?
Yeah, definitely. One of them is sort of choosing to write about older adults only when there's a story about frailty or about vulnerability or about illness. Those, sort of tired topics. I mean, it's like in a way, I mean, it's like that paint older adults in a certain light. In contrast, I mean, it's like I think one of the things that you can affirmatively do is to have interesting stories where you challenge the norms and expectations around older adults. I mean, just like at different stages of your life, you have different expectations depending on what society you come from or what community you come from. Let's, try to push those boundaries as well for older adults. What is expected of somebody who's 60, 70, 80, or 90? Is it just retirement? Is it just sitting around? Is it just, it's obviously a lot more than that because older adults are doing a lot. And that's a sort of a whole set of stories that has yet to be written or is not often written about.
Totally, very good point. Bobby, in a minute or so, if you're a reporter just looking to jump into this topic, what's a tip you would give for getting started? How would you, obviously it was a while ago that you got started in this field, but how would you as a reporter jump in?
I would talk to Caitlin. I would talk to Kevin with all the, because they represent networks of real live older New Yorkers and service providers. I would talk to me somewhat about, this home care program, working with home care workers and others. In other words, they are production. They can tell you the issues. They can tell you, where the location is. They can help you find the people. That's what you want as reporters. Equal pay day is this week. It's like tomorrow and the next day. We just talked about a low paid workforce. Report on equal pay day for the low paid workforce that serves older adults. Most reporters won't think of that angle. So again, May is Older Americans Month. There, we have something every month. This is Women's History Month. History, older women are history. So again, opening up the thinking. You've heard about immigration and everything. Anything that impacts New Yorkers impacts, younger New York, impacts older New Yorkers. And then finally, there's a world to be told. We haven't had time, but there's a world to be told about age discrimination in the workplace. It is rampant. City Council passed 5 bills last year. The Human Rights Commission did first ever legal guidance, so we saw some cracks in that. It is an undertold story, and it's an economic security issue that's rampant in this city. Thank you.
And Kevin, coming to you for a very final thought. Obviously, the gold standard for any reporter is not just to talk to experts or look at the literature or look up stats, but to talk to people who are actually living the problem and who are from the community in question. If you were a reporter speaking to an older New Yorker, what do you think is the most important question to ask that person? What's the one thing you would hope reporters, when they're speaking with older New Yorkers, bring up?
Yeah, it's a pretty broad question, but I think that the first thing that comes to mind is not so much about what they ask, but just to make sure that they listen. And I know it might sound oversimplified, but I think there are a lot of things in life that we know, but we still have to say to ourselves over and over and over again, right? And I think that's the most important thing. And it kind of jumped out at me a little bit earlier when Christian said the phrase that older people are not a monolith. Right, so you have very, very different lived experiences in this section of the population. Right, someone who is, in the AAPI community, 70 years old, owns a business and goes to work every day, has a very different lived experience than someone, who is 50 and maybe retired earlier than a lot of folks. So I think that that's the first thing to do, is just to really listen. And then the second thing is, and AARP New York has done some work on research on disrupting disparities is to really think about the other aspects of who they are and how that impacts them as well, whether it's race or gender identity, sexual orientation, economic status, things like that. That's all going to have a huge impact on them on their lived experience as well.
Excellent points, Kevin. Thank you so much to you and everyone on the panel, Caitlin, Kevin, Christian, and Bobby. Maybe you guys could put your email addresses in the chat for reporters looking to reach you as we wrap up here. But thanks so much to everyone for tuning in for this. Thank you to Daryl and the J School, and especially to Jennifer for running the show. It's been a pleasure, and I hope everyone has a great evening.